for our community. Really excited to have Lysa John here with me today. Lysa is the Secretary General of Civicus, which is an alliance of some 9,000 civil society and advocacy and campaigning organizations all over the world. And it's an organization that really has its fingers on the pulse of what's happening in so many countries. So I wanted to get a chance to talk to Lysa about a lot of issues related to the pandemic, kind of the secondary and tertiary effects of it. Really happy to have you. Thanks for joining, Lysa.
Thank you, Raj. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. And you're right now in Johannesburg, if I know right, which is the headquarters of Civicus.
Yes. Yes, I am.
And what's the situation like in South Africa at the moment?
Well, I think two things here. One, I mean, obviously, this is the place where, which has shown the world a lot about solidarity and movement. So you do see, labor issues and the labor unions, for instance, really being quite active on the rights of workers at this time. I think issues of just populations who've traditionally faced discrimination, especially in the context of gender-based violence, I think is very much part of the headlines. But more than that, I think also because South Africa chairs the African Union, there's a lot of information on what leaders across the continent are doing together. And therefore, I think the engagement, at least in my experience with civil society and the direct conversations we're having with regional bodies such as the AU or the Economic Commission of Africa are actually far higher than what I'm hearing from other regions. So it is a good place to be at this point, I think, and just in terms of lessons and opportunities to do things differently.
Now, your alliance has members in, I think, 175 countries. So, it's hard to generalize across such a wide area of the world. But what are you hearing from your members about this pandemic and what it means for their work?
Yeah, so I think, the COVID-19 pandemic has kind of altered ways of living and working in ways that we had never imagined before. I think what's reassuring is that the one thing that hasn't changed is how civil society has responded. I mean, across the world, in every corner, the reports we've got are how civil society organizations, which could be, small community-based organizations, just individuals who want to do good and do better, or major kind of regional or global organizations, all doing their bit, responding with a lot more urgency and agility than many governments have across the world. And then also, I think, really bringing to this space the range of expertise we have in civil society, which ranges from, the actual essential services and life-saving, support systems on the ground. But also, I think the conversations that we need to be having around accountability, I mean, really managing and tracking where public resources are going at this time. And then the responsive policies we need to build back better.
Yeah, you were early in this crisis to call for donors to change the way they work, saying donors have got to be more flexible, they've got to get more money out and support the organizations on the ground. What has been the response to that call? How do you think donors are doing right now in terms of supporting civil society?
So I think the reason we put out that call so early, and it was actually the first thing we did, was because we've been tracking civic space resourcing and the infrastructure that civil society has for several years now. I think two things have been very clear. The infrastructure that community organizations need to respond on the ground in a sustainable and systematic manner is highly inadequate. We know that 4 years ago, there was a commitment to the localization agenda at the World Humanitarian Summit. I mean, governments promised that they would increase the flow of resources to the global south and directly to local organizations without them having to interact with intermediaries. But what we've seen is that nothing has really changed. I mean, the levels of resource flows to the global south have remained the same. It's below 1% of ODA. So I think it just became very apparent to us also because 80% of our members are small organizations, that most organizations are caught in this really tight place between limited short-term funding and then whatever funding they have being extremely inflexible, so not really providing the space for them to kind of pivot very rapidly or change their course very rapidly. And for Civicus itself, we had actually come up with certain social protection measures that we wanted to adopt and we wanted all of our members to adopt. And that included ensuring that people don't lose their jobs and income during the period of lockdown. Now, the
Meaning
only
even the
way
workers within these civil society organizations.
Absolutely. So the only way you're going to be able to do that is by reallocating resources. So if you're not being allowed, if you can't travel, you can't really have face-to-face meetings, we need to be able to quickly move those resources to protect people's jobs. And therefore, I think it was really important for us to call on donors and say, let people have those conversations with you. In fact, you shouldn't even be waiting for them to approach you. You should be the ones, offering that flexibility. I think the results have been really great, and not just because of our letter, but just because there's been an increased appetite, especially among progressive foundations, to work in more flexible and sustainable ways. So I think our hope is that core and flexible funding will actually become the norm and not an exception as we come out of the pandemic, because we do know now that community organizations are going to be the ones who will have to pick up the responsibility of rebuilding societies on the ground as as movement is curtailed.
A lot of people I'm talking to think that maybe the localization agenda, which was talked about for a long time, but never really happened in a big way, right? There were steps, there was some progress, but it never happened in a big way. That maybe now this will be like a forcing mechanism because travel is curtailed. You can't send expats. Even if you hire international organizations, they have to use on the ground resources of various kinds. What do you think? Do you see this as that opportunity around localization? Are you seeing any early signs that might actually be the case?
I think a lot of people are talking about it. And I think, at the risk of offending some of my friends in the sector, I think this is the moment where we really need to be a little more angry and aggressive about making that happen. As much as we're calling on businesses and governments to be accountable, there's a huge agenda for accountability within civil society as well. And it means us working together to ensure that organizations on the ground are receiving direct resourcing, but it means that also that we need to be having uncomfortable conversations then with donors and also intermediary organizations. So the big organizations that actually receive money on behalf of the small organizations have to be willing to let go of that power and resource as well. So I think, as in every crisis, obviously people want to do a lot more, right? And the kind of ambition for radical reforms is always a lot higher. I think it's a really important moment now, especially for sector bodies. So not just as Civicus, but a lot of the other networks who manage or look out for civil society at large. There needs to be a much more, vocal and united voice on these transformations we need to make.
Yeah, it's usually at a moment like this when you can have that kind of paradigm shift, right? When things are scrambled, that it gives you a chance to maybe really change things. I guess, it is a controversial question, this idea of localization. I wonder how you look at it, because I know you used to lead campaigns at Save the Children International. You did it globally. And so a lot of the debate is what counts as localization. And I wonder, from your perspective, now that you run an alliance of so many different kinds of organizations around the world, what do you want to see if you were speaking to, DFID or the World Bank or to, major foundations? How should they think about localization? Is it, as long as there's a local entity, it could be part of an international network and it can hire local staff, that counts? Or does it have to be somehow indigenously started and run? How should we think about this?
So I think the three key words here would really be core, flexible, and diverse resourcing. So I think on one hand, we're saying, more donors need to release resources for the long-term changes that we want to see and not use civil society only as service delivery or implementation arms of what they want or to happen in the ground. And that's exactly the kind of trend you're seeing again in the COVID-19 crisis. So governments are calling on civil society. They want to work with civil society, but only as long as you're providing food or essential services. The minute you have an opinion about how governments are doing something, there's a clampdown. And in fact, the control of dissent is like one of the main threads or trends that we're seeing in civic space right now, where especially journalists and human rights activists are being targeted. I think in terms of diversity, as somebody who's also a citizen of the Global South, I think we are advocating with the traditional donors, right? That they simplify processes. They make it much easier for organizations on the ground to access resources directly without that large kind of train of bureaucratic procedures. But on the other hand, I think more southern governments also need to step up and own civil society. So we need publics and governments in the global south to really understand and embrace why civic freedoms are important and why both civil society and citizen action are actually things that society needs in order to progress and improve itself.
And I think on that last point, we're going backwards, aren't we? I mean, I follow your regular reports from Civicus, and you show that civic space has been closing year after year. You were involved in the SDG process. Many of the SDGs before this crisis, at least, were doing well, reasonably well. One that was absolutely going the opposite direction is freedom. And there are many metrics of it, but how do you judge this? You come from India, you're in South Africa now. A lot of the major middle income and low income countries of the world would probably fit into this category of having real challenges around press freedom and civic freedom. Where do you see it today? Where do you see it heading?
So I think one of the unfortunate trends over the past years has been that governments have not only managed to convince us, as in publics, that we need to give up our civic freedoms. So civic freedoms, I mean, the way we define it is the freedom of expression, association, and assembly. But they've also convinced us that other people don't have a right to those freedoms as well. So we're not only ready to let governments tell us that you don't have you don't have a right to an opinion, you cannot criticize us. You should not be asking for information about how the pandemic is affecting the country or what we're doing about it, and then don't even talk about like how the resources are flowing and why you should be part of it, right? But in addition to convincing us that we shouldn't be asking these questions, they've also managed to convince other sections of society, us, that other sections of society shouldn't be asking those questions either. So a lot of the backlash you're seeing, for instance, on migrant workers or refugees, women who are calling out and really talking about the shadow pandemic of domestic violence. You're seeing people wanting to shut them down because it's not okay for anyone to say anything outside the government line, quote unquote, at this time. So, the study that Civicus has done on how civic space trends have shifted since the announcement of the pandemic on April 11th is, I think, mainly in three key areas. So one, you're seeing a systematic move to restrict access to information and media. So across countries, with China and Vietnam being kind of key examples, censorship is really in full force. So you're really not able to access free information, both from citizens, so bloggers, social media users being targeted or punished just for sharing that something's going on in their neighborhood. And I think that's been a really worrying trend.
And do you see that is that worse now because of the pandemic? Are governments using the pandemic as kind of an excuse to clamp down on that kind of activity?
Absolutely. I think you even have countries in the Middle East who banned the production of newspapers, claiming that would actually help spread the virus because of the distribution and delivery system. So I think you're seeing very, very excessive measures where countries are either closing down on citizens who are speaking up on social media, and especially going after media houses and journalists. So there are several countries. I mean, Brazil tried to introduce a decree, for instance, to not allow the media to operate and report on what was happening. That was overturned. But Vietnam has prevented journalists from asking questions about the COVID pandemic. And then in many parts of Latin America and Africa, we're seeing individuals who are either activists or journalists actually being targeted, assaulted, even murdered, because that's also now, this has also become a moment where anyone who's talking about human rights or civic freedoms, you can get away with attacking them or kind of intimidating them without public or parliamentary scrutiny.
Yeah, it's a tremendously worrying trend, because it's part of a longer term trend. But now, in a moment like this, more can happen. I cut you off as you were about to talk about the second factor.
Of the resourcing.
I think you were getting into, we were talking about this issue of closing civic space,
Yes.
and what the pandemic has meant for that. And I realize one big area is exactly as you talked about press freedoms and people sharing content and information, but I think there are others as well.
Absolutely. And I think one of the areas which all of us, are kind of aware of, but don't really know what to do right away, is the aspect of surveillance and the invasion of our right to privacy. So you have, various governments, in fact, kind of coercing people to download apps and provide information about their health, which is simply not okay. Because there isn't really any protection on how that data is going to be used. And on the other hand, you have governments, including, for instance, Israel or Armenia, where you're actually, there's an active use of data to actually, to the extent that you're being monitored, you're being, tracked. And I think there simply isn't a justifiable enough reason for us to be allowing that to happen. Particularly when we know how governments and the private sector have exploited, private data. And I think that, it really poses a challenge for civil society, which hasn't really been as active on the digital kind of scope of rights and civic freedoms, to really hone in on that, particularly because now every aspect of our life is being lived online. And the flip side of that is really the point of digital exclusion. So for all of us who are middle class and can afford, a home and an internet connection, great, we're part of this global dialogue. But there are millions and millions of people who really aren't, part of this kind of circuit of access. So I think there's a huge danger now, even more so than before, of them being excluded from very important conversations on what governments are doing, or from them being part of, the public kind of imagination and debate of what governments need to be doing more of, or just, I think, with the right of association, for instance, being undermined. You have several governments who are kind of trying to regress on labor laws, or water down labor law provisions, including in some states in India this week. It just means that people just don't have the ability to collectively articulate their experience anymore. And I think that's the aspect that we also need to focus on, alongside the digital security aspect, because there's a whole world of people who are online and whose privacy and, kind of information is being kind of extracted and exploited. But there's another whole world of people who are offline and then being left out for a lot of systems as well.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge, and the facts on the ground keep changing very quickly because people are getting connectivity, life is moving online, and if you don't set up the right privacy and surveillance or counter surveillance policies and regulations, it's very easy for this to run away from us. And we wake up after a crisis like this, and tracking of our location, government access to our data could just be the norm in much of the world.
And I think what we're not watching out for, and what's happening very quietly, is that even the few systems to ensure democratic kind of accountability are being watered down, as we're kind of obsessed with just getting our lives together during the pandemic. So Hungary has been cited as an example, for instance, of a new measure where laws can be passed without parliamentary oversight. Cambodia has also passed a law where which allows the head of state to kind of really override any fundamental human rights, on the pretext of the public kind of good or security. So I think these are examples of the kind of leadership we do not need at this time. But just to make sure that it's not all doom and gloom, I think there are two really positive trends that we're seeing. One, I think we've heard a lot about countries like New Zealand or Germany, really coming to the fore. I think there's been a case made for feminist leadership, which is not just leadership from women, but leadership that kind of brings to life feminist values, and that's really working extremely well. So you do have local governments or state governments, as well as national governments responding also very with kind of the kind of sensitivity and maturity that you need, and the kind of exceptional leadership that this moment calls for. And at the same time, on the ground, I think you're seeing a profusion of individual action. So, it's quite ironic that as of December and even early January, we were at a stage when 2019 was being called the year of people power. There were more mass civic actions and movements across the world than we've ever seen before, including in 2011, during the time of the Tunisian revolution. So it was a political turning point. I mean, all of us were seeing that authoritarian regimes across the world were being challenged in a way that no one has ever, witnessed before. I'm actually getting goosebumps as I talk about it. And then in one fell stroke, you had the pandemic, and then, everybody was kind of locked into their homes. So it's almost like, some dictators got together and invented the virus just so that the world, order wouldn't change. I hope that's not true. But I think despite that, you're seeing a real flowering of, first, I think, just a level of empathy and solidarity that we have not seen in the last decade. I think the fight against hate and discrimination had become so bitter and so polarized across countries, and politicians were actually, fueling that division and divisiveness across society, even in traditional democracies like Brazil, US, and India. But I think you're just seeing a very huge, a big shift where people are coming back to values of compassion. Today is also the first day of a People's Forum for the UN at 75. So it's the 75th year of the United Nations. There was a survey undertaken, across countries, and almost 90,000 people involved. And people were asked what their priorities during the COVID-19 period were from governments, or what they wanted governments to do. The first was, of course, putting in place healthcare, like, very, very strong and robust healthcare systems. The second was more international solidarity. So I think that's a huge shift that none of us could have hoped for given the present circumstances. So in that context, I think the fact that you're seeing one on the ground, like I said, community organizations responding, beyond, above and beyond their kind of remit and resources to needs on the ground. But you're also seeing communities of care like growing and thriving across the world. So even as we're speaking, just today, we have a diversity and inclusion network called Digna that Civicus hosts. So you had almost 400 people talking about better ways to combat domestic violence during the pandemic. So I think that exchange of just knowledge and skills and tools has multiplied at a scale that wasn't really seen previously before. And I think just the need for better cooperation and collaboration has been reinforced in a very strong way. So it's a good sign, I think, for humanity that people want to manage their fear and uncertainty, the fact that they don't know whether they're going back to work or will be able to travel in the next few months, by focusing on the positive outcomes we can achieve as a society. And I'm just going to end by saying that even the survey that came out of the UK this week, where 6 out of 10 people wanted to see well-being rather than GDP as the focus of prosperity or progress, I think is a really good sign for us, and something we need to build on quite quickly.
Yeah, I think even in the advanced world, there will be a lot of people rethinking the way life was before this pandemic and saying, do I want to go back to, the kind of rat race, is that really what I want? And what really matters, and what should our values be? I think this is, you're right, there is an upside to a crisis like this, which is a chance to rethink and a chance for global solidarity. That's a word I'm hearing a lot as I do these conversations with leaders like yourself. In fact, Winnie Byanyima was talking about it with me just a few days ago and talking about the importance of a vaccine. And I understand today there's a letter out from her. She's, of course, the head of UNAIDS, the executive director of UNAIDS, and a number of other global leaders saying, hey, we need a people's vaccine. And we need a moment of global solidarity where once a vaccine for this, for COVID-19 is developed, it has to be available to all people in the world, regardless of their ability to pay. So I think you're right. There is an upside to any crisis, a potential upside, but there's going to be a fight to make sure that those same tools that are used to organize and to campaign and mobilize aren't controlled and taken away from groups like your own.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge kind of point of focus for most civil society groups across the world, that we shouldn't really go back to where we were after the global financial crisis. So if you remember 10 years ago, we were hearing very similar statements and kind of ambitions for how there would be a new economic order as a result of the financial crisis. And then as soon as things got better, we kind of forgot about it and went back to business as usual. And I think the reason that happens is the lack of really strong public pressure on governments and on leaders to walk the talk on the changes that they've promised. And this is not just government, but also business leaders. And of course, for those of us who run organizations as well. So I think it's a really important moment again for accountability at various levels. So, I mean, within our own organizations, for instance, Civicus has brought out a social security protocol where we're asking all civil society organizations to sign up to protecting their employees first, because our response in the world is really dependent on how we protect the people who work with us. Also recognizing that 70% of the sector is really comprised of women workers. So if organizations undertake cost-cutting measures, it is the women who will lose their jobs first. But having said that, I think in a broader sense, it's also a moment for us to kind of be leaderful at all levels. And I'm borrowing this actually from, in fact, one of the movements, and an activist from Hong Kong, because, the Hong Kong kind of activism was called a leaderless movement, in last year. And this person, Johnson, said, it's not a leaderless movement, it's a leaderful movement. So this and all of the other movements that we saw in 2019 were actually leaderful because it was made up of individuals who were not part of organizations, who were in other professions, but coming together and taking ownership for the change they wanted to see. So you saw that in Sudan, you saw that in a range of contexts around the world. And I think that's the same kind of spirit we need to embody as we kind of deal with the pandemic. I mean, we really need to remember the fundamentals. We need to remember the kind of changes and shifts we need to see in our social and economic structures, and not go back to where we were in 2019, at least in terms of the transformative systems and what we want to achieve in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals as well.
When you talk about the leaderful movement, I can't help but think of some of the amazing young climate activists I've gotten to meet in the past year or two. Obviously, we all know Greta Thunberg, but beyond that, there's so many other activists, young people from around the world who have stood up on the climate issue. And it makes me think really what we're facing are two crises. There's a twin crisis of the pandemic, which is very acute and immediate. We see it, obviously, it's changed life so quickly. But then there's a climate crisis, which is ongoing as well at the same time. And it's part of the reason I think we need that new approach to how we come out of this pandemic situation. It has to be a green approach, right, to how we change the economy and how we think about the global development issues that we're all grappling with, because this is it's really not just one crisis, right?
Yeah. And I think the silver lining is that, last year we thought all of the changes we wanted in the world were, kind of utopian and impossible, and nobody at scale would adopt these changes. This year we have found that actually people can change their behaviors, and we can alter the way we live and work and travel pretty significantly. But I think the real battle will be fought again, when around the domain of resources and policies. So as public resources are being generated, I know for the African continent, for instance, we're calling for a debt standstill, we're calling for greater domestic mobilization of resources. The international community needs to support the global south through this crisis. But that also means that, the end outcomes of how those resources are spent are going to be heavily dependent on how citizens track and ask for answers around that. So it's again linked to the point of civic freedoms and the ability to actually cope with accountability.
That's definitely the case with debt, because right now what's happened essentially is suspension of debt payments, which means the debt is still owed and there's still interest, it's just delayed. But perhaps the next step will be to cancel some debt. And as you say, in some ways, that's exactly what we all want in the global development community, because it means governments will have access to that funding to make their own decisions. And so decision-making will be at the country level, but it does require accountability on the part of citizens. Otherwise, that money could be spent on things which are not appropriate for the country's own development.
Yes, true. And I think the second point I wanted to make was about new forms of organizing. I think we just cannot underestimate the power of big transnational companies. They've managed to get away with murder before. They will continue to do that, and authoritarian governments. So I think there's a real challenge we face as civil society and as activists to really, I mean, in building back better, also building our voice and our power and our impact much better. And that again connects with the funding question, because if civil society, if 80% or 90% of civil society is being resourced to not think beyond a 1-year delivery project, you're basically, you know, really clamping down on the kind of potential we have for change. So there is an interconnected system, I think, that needs to kind of shift and, you know, kind of unwind at different levels in order for us to really unleash that force of change that we want to be.
Yeah, so much of it does come down to that idea of control, money, who's funding. You know, this is a complex set of issues, but thank you so much, Lysa, for taking some time to unpack it all for us. We really appreciate this, and for the great work you and your Alliance members are doing all over the world. Please keep us informed at DevX what we need to know as we cover these stories. I will commend to everyone some of our recent coverage on gender-based violence during the pandemic, and some of the other issues we've talked about, as DevX has made all of our COVID-related coverage free of charge and open to the public. And our team of journalists around the world is really working very hard during this period, as I know many of you out there are in your organizations, to try to keep everybody informed. So we greatly appreciate that community of 1 million development professionals around the world who are part of DevX. Thank you for joining this conversation, all of you. We've got people, Lysa, from around the world who are on this live recording, and we look forward to pushing it out there to more of you. Thank you so much, Lysa. Thanks to you and to your whole team at Civicus.
Thank you. Thank you.